The first story was told by a man named Dewey. According to him, this happened around 12 or 13 years ago in some Mao, back when he was only a teenager. At the time, after school, he and the other boys in the village would often head deep into the mangrove forest to catch snails and fish. The deeper they went into the swamp, the more snails they could find. They would bring everything back to the market and sell it for a little extra money every trip. The group traveled together on a small wooden boat that could carry 5 or 6 people at a time, along with the kids. There was usually an older married couple and a woman from the village everyone called Aunt Lai. Normally, Aunt Lai always went with the group and came home with them too. But one day, something felt different. Around noon, after hours under burning sun, everyone had already caught enough and was preparing to head back for lunch. The boys started gathering their buckets and calling for Aunt Lai, but instead of returning, she just stood there alone in the middle of the swamp, not moving, not catching snails, just staring blankly into the forest. One of the boys yelled out, "Aunt Lai, it's already noon. Aren't you coming back? It's hot as hell out here." Without even turning around, she replied, "You kids go home first. I barely caught anything today. I'm staying a little longer." The boys looked into her bucket. She was right. There was barely anything inside. So they shrugged and told her not to stay too late, because her husband might start worrying. But Aunt Lai only laughed. "I've been coming here for decades," she said. "You think I know the way home?" And with that, the group left, leaving her completely alone in the swamp. Back then, nobody thought much of it. She was an adult. If she wanted to stay behind and catch more snails, that was her business. So the boys returned home like normal. That night, after dinner, everyone gathered in the village to watch movies together. At the time, electricity still hadn't reached the area. There was an old woman who owned a small generator, and whenever people bought drinks from her stand, she would turn it on so the villagers could watch movies outside at night. The film had barely started when suddenly someone came running through the village shouting. Everyone turned immediately. It was Uncle Gwen, Aunt Lai's husband. He looked panicked. Breathing heavily, he asked, "Has anyone seen my wife? She went out catching snails this morning and still hasn't come home." The narrator froze. "Aunt Lai was with us earlier," he explained. "But at noon she refused to leave. She said she hadn't caught enough snails yet." The moment Uncle Gwen heard that, his face turned pale. "What nonsense is that?" he snapped. "Who still catches snails this late at night? It's pitch black out there." The entire area was surrounded by forest and swamp. Houses were scattered far apart, and after dark, almost nobody went outside. Panic slowly spread through the village. Uncle Gwen rushed from house to house asking if anyone had seen her, but nobody had. Finally, he borrowed a small boat and gathered several men from the village to help search the swamp where they had gone earlier that day. But things were different now. In the morning, the tide had been low, exposing the muddy ground beneath the swamp. Now the water had risen high enough to swallow half a person whole. The men pushed deeper and deeper into the darkness, shining flashlights across the muddy water and tangled trees. And then suddenly, Uncle Gwen froze. Far ahead, under the weak beam of a flashlight, someone was standing motionless in the swamp. Only half of the body was visible above the mud. Even from a distance, he recognized her instantly. It was Aunt Lai. Without thinking, Uncle Gwen jumped straight out of the boat and rushed toward the figure. The closer he got, the colder his body felt. Aunt Lai was standing perfectly still in the middle of the swamp, not moving, not blinking, just standing there like a statue buried in the mud. Beside her was the bucket she had carried earlier that day, completely empty. No snails, no fish, nothing. Lai! Uncle Gwen shouted desperately. "What's wrong with you?" But she didn't answer. Her eyes stared blankly into the darkness as if she couldn't even hear him. One of the villagers immediately whispered, "She's been taken." Another muttered, "A spirit caught her soul." The deeper parts of the mangrove forest were infamous for stories like that. People believed strange things lived beneath the muddy water, things that waited for anyone foolish enough to wander too far alone. The men quickly grabbed Aunt Lai and carried her back onto the boat. But the moment they touched her, everyone felt it. Her body was stiff, completely stiff, like they were lifting a stone statue instead of a living human being. Even worse, her eyes had rolled upward until only the whites remained visible. Mud covered her entire body from head to toe. Nobody dared speak during the ride home. When they finally reached the village, the family rushed her behind the house and started washing the swamp mud off her body. That was when they noticed something horrifying. Her skin was covered in dark purple bruises. Everywhere, and inside her mouth, there was dried mud packed between her teeth and deep into her throat. It looked as if she had been forced to swallow mud for hours under the burning sun until it hardened inside her mouth. The villagers had to pour water into her throat just to soften the mud enough to pull it out. The older people standing nearby exchanged frightened looks. Everyone already believed the same thing. Something in the swamp had taken hold of her. An elderly woman named Aunt Chin hurried into the room, carrying a string of prayer beads and a small statue of Guanyin. She slowly placed the statue in front of Aunt Lai and softly asked, "Lai, do you recognize me?" No response. Aunt Lai remained frozen. Then Aunt Chin carefully slipped the prayer beads around her neck, and suddenly Aunt Lai's body jerked violently, like someone waking up from a nightmare. A second later, she burst into tears. Not normal crying. The kind of crying that sounded like pure terror finally breaking free. Between sobs, she finally began speaking. She said that after everyone left, she stayed behind because her bucket was still almost empty. She kept wandering deeper and deeper into the swamp, searching for more snails. At some point, without realizing it, night had fallen, and then suddenly she stopped walking because standing in front of her was something she would never forget for the rest of her life. At first, Aunt Lai thought she was imagining things. The swamp was completely silent by then. No wind, no insects, nothing. Then slowly, something began rising out of the mud in front of her. Not walking, not climbing, rising. Aunt Lai said the thing looked like a woman, but not fully human. Its head was completely bald, smooth and pale under the moonlight. Its eyes bulged outward, so far they looked ready to fall from their sockets. And the lower half of its body wasn't made of legs. It was covered in long, dangling tendrils that dragged to the mud like roots or octopus limbs. But the worst part was its neck, because growing from the same neck were two heads, two identical bald heads connected to one body. The moment Aunt Lai saw it, her entire body locked up in fear. "I wanted to run," she said later, "but my legs wouldn't move." The creature slowly crawled toward her through the mud, dragging itself closer, closer, leaving a long trail behind it. Then Antlion noticed something else. In one hand, the creature was holding a steamed bun, in the other, a slice of sticky rice cake. The second she saw those things, pure terror hit her. People in the countryside believed spirits often use food to trick the living, especially lonely travelers lost at night. Antlion knew immediately. This thing was not human, but all she could do was silently pray. The creature kept crawling closer until the tendrils beneath its body finally reached her feet. Cold, slimy, they wrapped tightly around her legs, then slowly climbed upward around her body. Antlion said she felt herself being dragged downward into the mud little by little. At the same time, the creature lifted the steam bun toward her face. "I don't know why," she cried, but my mouth kept opening by itself. The creature shoved the bun deep into her throat, again and again, forcing the food farther inside until she could barely breathe. Mud and dirty water filled her mouth. Her body sank deeper into swamp. At that point, only her head was still above the mud. And then, just as the creature was about to force her completely under, something happened. Antlion suddenly felt someone pulling her upward from behind. Hard, like another force was fighting against the creature. But she never saw who it was. She only remembered the pressure around her body suddenly disappearing. The tendrils loosened. The creature stopped moving. And somehow, she was able to stand again. After that, Antlion said she could no longer move at all. She simply stood there frozen in the middle of the swamp for hours until her husband finally found her. The moment Antlion finished telling the story, the entire room fell silent. Nobody dared speak. The only sound was her crying. Then suddenly, Antlion looked up in panic and asked, "Wait, where's my bucket?" Everyone turned toward her. "My bucket of snails," she continued nervously. "Before I saw that thing, I found a place deep in the swamp where there were tons of snails everywhere. Crabs too, tiny shrimp. I filled the whole bucket before it appeared." She grabbed her husband's arm desperately. "When you brought me home, did you bring a bucket too?" Uncle Gwen suddenly froze because he remembered earlier in all the panic, he really had carried her bucket back home and left it outside in the yard. One of the men quickly went to get it. The moment he carried it inside, everyone gathered around. Then slowly, they emptied the bucket onto the floor. And immediately, people screamed because there were no snails inside. Not a single one. Instead, dozens of strange black creatures rolled across the ground. Round, dark, covered in rough spikes. At first glance, they looked almost like sea urchins, but not exactly. Their spikes weren't sharp. They were short, soft, and rubbery looking. The narrator said they resembled those sticky rubber toys children throw against walls, except these things were black and wet and looked horrifyingly alive. The villagers stared in disgust. What the hell are those things? Nobody knew. Even Antlion shook her head violently. "I didn't catch those," she whispered. "I swear those weren't what I picked up." One of the men carefully poked the creature with a stick. It rolled slightly across the floor. That was when everyone noticed something even worse. Tiny holes covered its surface, and some of them looked disturbingly similar to eyes. The room instantly erupted in panic. The men grabbed sticks and began smashing the creatures one by one. Pop, pop, pop. The things burst open like rotten fruit. A foul brown liquid splattered across the ground, thick, muddy, and smelling like swamp water mixed with rotting flesh. The stench was unbearable. Some people nearly vomited on the spot. Aunt Chin stepped backward in horror. "Oh my God," she muttered. "That thing in the swamp wasn't ordinary." Then she turned toward Aunt Lai. "You were caught by something evil down there," she said quietly. "Not a normal wandering spirit, something much worse." Everyone in the countryside had heard stories about the drowned swamp spirits that dragged people underwater. But this creature was different. Aunt Chin continued, "I've heard of water ghosts before, but never one with two heads." Aunt Lai nodded weakly, her face pale with terror. "I saw it clearly," she whispered. "Two heads growing from the same neck, and the lower body looked like octopus tentacles dragging to the mud." Nobody spoke after that. The villagers quickly gathered the remains of the creatures and threw them into a pile of firewood outside. Then they lit the pile on fire. The second the flames touched the bodies, the fire turned green. Not orange, not yellow, green. The villagers immediately backed away in fear. Some started praying under their breath. Others whispered that Aunt Lai was lucky to have survived, because whatever she encountered that night was no ordinary ghost. Everyone thought the nightmare was finally over. Aunt Lai had made it home alive. Whatever happened in the swamp was behind her now. But strangely, even after calming down, Aunt Lai still looked terrified. The narrator said her face remained pale purple, and her eyes kept darting nervously around the house like she was afraid of something invisible standing nearby. Then suddenly, she looked around frantically and asked, "Where's my son?" Everyone froze. "Where's Tien?" she asked again, louder this time. "Where did he go?" Tien was her son, a boy around the same age as the narrator. He usually hung around with the same group of kids in the village. One of the adults answered, "He's probably outside in the front yard." But Aunt Lai immediately shook her head. No, call him here right now." Something in her voice made everyone uneasy. One of the boys ran outside to look for him. A few minutes later, he came back confused. "Tien's not outside." The room suddenly fell silent again. His friends started checking nearby houses. Nothing. Some searched around the village paths. Still nothing. That was when fear began spreading through the house all over again, because nobody remembered seeing Tien since the afternoon. Uncle Gwyn tried calming everyone down. "He's probably off playing somewhere," he said. "That kid disappears all the time." But Aunt Lai looked like she was about to break down. Then slowly, she began crying again. Only this time, her crying sounded different, more desperate, more frightened. "I think it followed me home," she whispered. The adults immediately turned toward her. Aunt Chin frowned. "What do you mean?" Aunt Lai stared blankly toward the dark doorway leading outside. "That thing in the swamp," she whispered. "I think it wanted something from me." Nobody moved. Nobody even breathed. Then Aunt Lai slowly lifted her trembling hand and pointed toward the yard outside. "When it was dragging me into the mud," she said weakly, "I kept hearing children crying." The room instantly turned ice cold. "Not one child," she continued. "Many children." Some of the villagers exchanged frightened looks, because stories about Mada often involve drowned spirits dragging victims away to replace themselves. But this sounded different. Aunt Lai lowered her voice even further. "I think those things in the bucket," she swallowed hard, "weren't eggs." Nobody said a word. Then suddenly, From somewhere outside the house came the sound of something wet dragging slowly across the ground. Slurch, slurch, slurch. Everyone in the room froze. Nobody slept that night. After the creature disappeared back into the darkness, the villagers immediately shut every door and window in the house. Some people stayed behind to help guard the family, while others hurried home before midnight. But the fear remained. Nobody could forget what they had just seen, especially the sound. Those crying children inside the creature's throat. The narrator said even the older men in the village looked shaken. These were people who had spent their whole lives living near rivers and swamps. Most of them had heard ghost stories before, but this was something else. Inside the house, Aunt Lai sat trembling under a blanket, while Aunt Chin quietly prayed beside her. Every few minutes, Aunt Lai would suddenly look toward the door like she expected something to crawl back inside at any second. Then, sometime deep into the night, someone finally returned. It was Tien. The moment he walked into the yard, everyone rushed toward him at once. "Where the hell have you been?" Uncle Gwyn shouted, but Tien only looked confused. He said he had fallen asleep at a friend's house after playing all afternoon. At first, everyone felt relieved, but then the narrator noticed something strange. Tien's clothes were wet, not soaked like rainwater, wet with mud, dark swamp mud. Aunt Lai noticed it too. Her face instantly turned white. "Tien," she whispered shakily, "where did you go tonight?" The boy frowned. "I told you already. I was at my friend's house." But Aunt Lai suddenly grabbed his arm. "Hard. So why is there mud on your clothes?" Tien immediately pulled away, annoyed. "I don't know. Maybe I fell somewhere earlier." The adults exchanged nervous glances. Then Aunt Chin slowly walked closer to the boy, and the moment she stood near him, her expression changed completely. The old woman stared at Tien for several long seconds without speaking. Then quietly, she reached into her pocket and pulled out the same prayer beads she had used on Aunt Lai earlier. "Tien," she said softly, "come here for a second." The boy hesitated, but eventually stepped closer. The instant Aunt Chin touched the beads against his wrist, Tien screamed. Not a normal scream, a horrifying, animal-like shriek that echoed through the entire house. Everyone jumped back in terror. The boy collapsed on the floor, thrashing violently. And then, from his mouth, came the sound of children crying. The exact same sound a creature had made outside the house. Dozens of voices, crying all at once. Aunt Lai began screaming hysterically. Uncle Gwyn grabbed his son, trying to hold him down, but Tien's body twisted violently like something inside him was fighting to get out. Then suddenly, the boy stopped moving, completely still. For several seconds, nobody dared move. Then slowly, Tien lifted his head and smiled, but it wasn't his smile, because at the same moment, his voice changed. Cold, wet, almost like two voices speaking together at once. And the thing inside him whispered, "He came back with her." The moment those words came out of Tien's mouth, the entire room froze, because the voice speaking through him did not sound human. It sounded wet, broken, like two different voices overlapping each other at the same time. "He came back with her." Aunt Lai immediately collapsed into tears. Uncle Gwyn grabbed his son's shoulders violently. "Who are you?" he shouted. "What did you do to my boy?" Tien slowly lifted his head and smiled again, a smile so unnatural that several people immediately backed away. Then the boy began laughing softly, but underneath the laughter, everyone could still hear the faint sound of children crying. Aunt Chin reacted instantly. She grabbed the guanine statue from the table and pressed it against Tien's chest while shouting prayers. The second the statue touched him, Tien screamed. His entire body arched backward unnaturally, almost bending like his spine was about to snap. Then suddenly, all the lamps inside the house went out. Darkness swallowed everything. Women screamed. Children cried. Outside, the sound returned again. Slurch, slurch, slurch. Something was crawling around the house. The villagers could hear it circling slowly outside the walls. At the same time, Tien began choking violently on the floor. Mud started pouring from his mouth. Not water, mud. Thick black swamp mud mixed with strands of rotten grass. The smell was unbearable. Aunt Lai screamed and tried rushing toward him, but several people held her back. Then suddenly, Tien opened his eyes, and for a split second, the narrator swore he saw another face reflected inside them. Not the boy's face. Something bald, something pale, something with bulging eyes. Aunt Chin continued praying louder and louder. The prayer beads wrapped around her hands so tightly they nearly cut into her skin. Meanwhile, outside the house, the dragging sound suddenly stopped. Complete silence. Then came a loud thud against the wall. Everyone jumped. Another thud, this time from the back of the house. Whatever was outside was trying to get in. The villagers grabbed sticks, machetes, anything they could find, but nobody dared open the door. Inside, Tien's body continued convulsing violently. Then, all at once, he sat upright, completely still, his head slowly turned toward Aunt Lai, and in that same overlapping voice, the thing inside him whispered, "It wants him now." Aunt Lai began sobbing uncontrollably. "No, please, please leave my son alone." The creature inside Tien tilted his head strangely, almost curious. Then it whispered one final sentence that made everyone's blood run cold. "You escaped the mud." A long pause filled the room. Then, "But he won't." After that night, Aunt Lai became obsessed with protecting her son. She no longer dared go anywhere near the swamp again. Every single day, she warned Tien the same thing over and over. Don't go near water. Don't go swimming. Don't follow your friends to the river. Do you hear me? At first, the villagers thought she was simply traumatized. But then strange things started happening to Tien. Every night while he slept, he felt something pulling on his legs beneath the bed. At first, he thought he was dreaming, but whenever he woke up, his legs would already be wet, not with clean water, with cold, muddy swamp water. Sometimes there was slime stuck to his skin. The boy became terrified. One night, he finally confessed everything to his mother. He said every time he closed his eyes, he kept seeing the same thing, a dark figure crouching at the foot of his bed, completely black, completely still, except for the two bald heads staring directly at him. Then slowly, it would reach out one long wet arm, grab his leg, and start pulling. Aunt Lai nearly fainted after hearing that, because she knew immediately the thing from the swamp had followed her home. From that point on, she refused to leave Tien alone even for a moment. If she visited someone's house, she dragged him along. If she went to the market, He had to stay beside her. Even while sleeping, she kept checking whether he was still breathing. But no matter what she did, the nightmares only became worse. Sometimes Tien woke up screaming in the middle of the night, claiming he could hear children crying outside the house. Other nights, he said he heard something crawling slowly beneath the floorboards. Slurch, 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 and every time the sound stopped, he could feel cold fingers touching his feet. The villagers started whispering that the spirit wanted the boy. Some believed Aunt Lai had accidentally offered her son's name to the creature that night in the swamp. Others believed the thing simply marked him after failing to take her soul. Either way, everyone agreed on one thing. Tien was no longer safe. Then one afternoon, only a few days later, Aunt Lai brought Tien with her to a neighbor's house to play cards. The house belonged to an old woman named Aunt Nam, whose home sat right beside the river. While the adults sat outside gambling and chatting, the children played inside near the back of the house. Hours passed peacefully, until suddenly, someone screamed from the riverside dock behind the house. The scream came from behind the house. Everyone outside immediately froze. One of the women dropped her cards and shouted, "The kid!" The kid fell into the river. Aunt Lai's face turned white instantly. She ran toward the back dock like a madwoman. When she reached the riverbank, the other children were already crying and pointing at the water. Tien was standing there. One of them sobbed. Then something grabbed him. Without hesitation, Uncle Nam jumped into the river first. Then several other men followed. Everyone searched frantically through the muddy water, but there was no sign of the boy. Nothing. The river was dark and deep from the recent tides. Thick swamp water churned beneath the dock, making it impossible to see more than a few inches underwater. Aunt Lai collapsed on the ground, screaming her son's name over and over. Then suddenly, one of the men in the river shouted, "I found him." Everyone rushed toward the voice. A few seconds later, the men dragged Tien back onto the dock. The boy was unconscious. His entire body was freezing cold, and wrapped tightly around one of his ankles was a thick strand of black swamp grass. No, not grass. The narrator said it looked more like one of those dangling tendrils from the creature Aunt Lai described. The second Aunt Lai saw it, she started screaming hysterically, "Don't touch it!" One of the older men immediately grabbed a knife and cut the thing away from the boy's ankle. The moment the blade sliced through it, dark, muddy liquid burst out onto the dock, and from somewhere deep beneath the river, everyone heard it. A scream, not human, something shrill and wet echoing underwater. The men backed away immediately. Nobody wanted to stay near the river anymore. They carried Tien back inside the house and tried warming him up. After several minutes, the boy finally coughed violently and spat muddy water across the floor. Then he opened his eyes. For one brief second, his pupils looked completely white, just like Aunt Lai's the night she was found in the swamp. The entire room fell silent. Then slowly, Tien looked around at everyone and whispered weakly, "She's angry now." Aunt Lai immediately burst into tears. "What does she want from us?" she cried. Tien's lips trembled slightly. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he answered. She said, "I belong to the water now." That was the moment the villagers finally realized this was no ordinary haunting anymore. Whatever lived in that swamp was trying to take the boy completely, and if they didn't stop it soon, Tien was going to die. By the next morning, the entire village already knew what had happened. Nobody dared let their children near the river anymore. Some people even refused to go out after sunset. The older villagers all agreed on one thing. They needed spiritual help, because whatever was haunting Tien was no longer acting like a normal ghost. That afternoon, Uncle Gwyn traveled to a small temple several villages away to seek help from an old monk who was rumored to understand spirits and swamp hauntings. The monk was already elderly, thin and quiet, with sharp eyes that made people uncomfortable whenever he stared too long at them. After hearing the entire story, the old monk remained silent for a long time. Then finally he asked one question. When your wife encountered the creature, did it offer food? Uncle Gwyn froze, because that was exactly what happened. The monk slowly closed his eyes. That spirit wanted to feed her, he said quietly. Once the living accept food from the dead, a connection is formed. Uncle Gwyn's face turned pale. But she didn't eat willingly, he argued. It forced the food into her mouth. The monk nodded slowly. That's why she survived. The room became silent. Then the monk continued. But the spirit failed to take her completely. So now it wants a replacement. Uncle Gwyn immediately thought of Tien. The old monk then explained something the villagers had never heard before. Long ago, deep within the mangrove swamps, there were stories about drowned spirits that collected souls. Most people called them Mada, but according to old legends, some spirits stayed trapped underwater for so long that they eventually changed into something worse, something hungry, something no longer fully human. And if enough victims were taken, the spirit would continue growing stronger. The monk believed the crying voices inside the creature belonged to trapped souls, children, people who had drowned long ago and never escaped. That was why the thing had two heads. It had already begun transforming into something unnatural, something ancient. Uncle Gwyn could barely speak anymore. So, what do we do? The old monk opened a small wooden box beside him and removed several items: prayer beads, blessed paper charms, and a rusted iron nail. This nail, the monk said quietly, must be driven into place where the spirit first touched your wife. Uncle Gwyn stared at him in confusion. The swamp? The monk nodded, but listened carefully. His voice became much colder. If the spirit appears again, do not let it speak to the boy. A chill ran through the room. Why? Uncle Gwyn whispered. The monk slowly looked toward him. Because the longer the spirit speaks through him, the less human he becomes. That same night, the villagers prepared to return to the swamp. Nobody wanted to go, but everyone understood one thing now. If they did nothing, Tien would eventually be taken. The old monk came with them personally. Before leaving, he tied blessed threads around everyone's wrists and warned them repeatedly. No matter what you hear in the swamp tonight, do not answer voices calling your name. The group traveled by boat in complete silence. The deeper they moved into the mangrove forest, the quieter the world became. Even the insects seemed to disappear. Only the sound of water pushing against the boat remained. The monk sat near the front, holding prayer beads tightly in one hand and the rusted iron nail in the other. Meanwhile, Tien sat beside his mother, shaking uncontrollably, because ever since sunset, he had been hearing children crying again, softly, somewhere far away in the darkness. Eventually, they reached the exact place where Antli had first encountered the creature. The swamp looked even worse at night. Black mud stretched endlessly beneath twisted mangrove roots. The air smelled rotten, heavy, almost alive. The old monk stepped out first. The mud immediately swallowed his legs almost to the knees. Then suddenly, Tien began trembling violently. "She's here," he whispered. Everyone froze. The monk raised his lantern higher. At first, there was nothing. Then slowly, movement appeared in the darkness ahead. Slurch, slurch, slurch. Something was dragging itself across the mud again. And then the creature emerged, exactly as Antli had described. 2 bald heads, bulging pale eyes, long black tendrils dragging beneath its body, and behind it, dozens of smaller shapes slowly rising from the mud, child-sized figures. The villagers nearly panicked immediately, but the monk shouted, "Don't look into their eyes." The crying voices started again, children sobbing, begging for help. Some even sounded like people the villagers recognized. One man suddenly stepped forward in shock. "That sounds like my younger brother." The monk immediately grabbed him back. "They are not your dead." The creature stopped several feet away from Tien. Both heads slowly tilted at the same time. Then the overlapping voice returned. "You brought him back to us." Tien suddenly screamed in pain and collapsed into the mud. Dark swamp water poured from his mouth. The creature began crawling closer. Faster now. The tendrils beneath its body spread across the mud like living snakes. The monk instantly started chanting prayers louder and louder while pressing the iron nail into the ground. The moment the nail pierced the mud, the swamp exploded with screams. Not one scream. Hundreds. The mud around them began bubbling violently as if something underneath was waking up. Then suddenly, small pale hands started emerging from the swamp. Children's hands. Dozens of them, reaching upward from beneath the mud. The villagers started screaming in terror. Meanwhile, the creature lunged directly toward Tien. But before it could reach him, the monk slammed the iron nail completely into the swamp. And instantly, everything stopped. Silence. Absolute silence. The creature froze mid-movement. Its 2 heads twisted unnaturally toward the monk. Then both mouths opened wide at the same time. And the entire swamp let out one final deafening scream. That scream echoed across the swamp for several long seconds. Then suddenly, the creature's body began sinking, slowly, violently, as if something beneath the mud was dragging it downward. The tendrils beneath its body whipped wildly across the swamp, splashing black water everywhere. The smaller childlike figures around it immediately started screaming too. Not angry screams, terrified screams. The villagers watched in horror as pale hands continued reaching upward from beneath the mud all around them. It looked as if countless dead children were trapped underneath the swamp itself. The old monk kept chanting nonstop while gripping his prayer beads, so tightly his hands began bleeding. Meanwhile, the creature struggled harder and harder. Its 2 heads twisted in opposite directions unnaturally, both mouths opening wider than any human mouth possibly could. And then the crying voices changed. Instead of screaming, the children suddenly began begging. "Help us, please. It's cold." The narrator said several villagers instantly broke down crying after hearing those voices. But the monk shouted again, "Do not listen." Then the swamp beneath the creature suddenly collapsed inward, The mud swallowed half its body immediately. The creature let out another horrible scream and lunged toward Tien one final time. But this time dozens of pale hands burst from beneath the mud and grabbed it. The villagers watched in frozen terror as tiny hands wrapped around the creature's tendrils, its necks, its heads, pulling it downward, slowly, forcefully. The creature shrieked so loudly people covered their ears. And during those final seconds, the narrator swore he saw something horrifying. The faces of children, dozens of them, appearing beneath the muddy water around the creature, like trapped souls finally rising to the surface. Then suddenly, everything disappeared beneath the swamp. Silence, complete silence. Even the wind stopped. Nobody moved for several long seconds. Then Tien suddenly coughed violently. A massive amount of black swamp water poured from his mouth onto the mud. His whole body trembled once, then finally went still. Aunt Lai rushed forward crying and pulled her son into her arms. This time, his eyes looked normal again. The overlapping voice was gone. The old monk slowly stepped backward, breathing heavily. Then he looked toward the swamp one final time and quietly said, "It's over." But strangely, his expression did not look relieved. One of the villagers asked shakily, "What were those hands?" The old monk remained silent for a long time, then finally answered, "Victims." Nobody spoke after that. The monk explained that spirits like that creature often trapped souls beneath the water for years, sometimes decades. The crying children the villagers heard were likely real souls that had never escaped. And when the iron nail sealed the spirit's resting place, the trapped souls finally dragged it back down with them. The villagers left the swamp before sunrise. Nobody dared look back. And from that day onward, the deeper part of the mangrove forest was completely abandoned. No one hunted there. No one fished there. Nobody even traveled near it after dark anymore. As for Tien, he survived. But according to the narrator, the boy was never completely the same afterward. Sometimes in the middle of the night, villagers still heard him talking in his sleep, whispering to someone unseen. And every once in a while, during heavy rainstorms, Aunt Lai would wake up to find muddy footprints leading from outside the house, straight to her son's bed. Years passed after that night in the swamp. Little by little, life in the village returned to normal. People stopped talking openly about the creature. Children were warned never to wander too deep into the mangrove forest again, especially after sunset. And eventually, the story became just another terrifying legend whispered among villagers during rainy nights. But the narrator said there was one thing nobody could ever fully explain. Even after the spirit disappeared, strange things still happened around Tien. Sometimes, late at night, neighbors claimed they could hear him speaking softly in his sleep, not talking normally, whispering, as if he were having conversations with someone standing beside his bed. Other times, Aunt Lai would wake up suddenly in the middle of the night, feeling an unbearable coldness inside the house. And whenever she checked on her son, she would sometimes find wet mud beneath his bed, fresh mud, as if something had crawled in from outside while everyone was asleep. But the most horrifying thing happened years later. One stormy night during high tide, Uncle Gwyn was returning home alone by boat after drinking with friends in another village. The river was almost completely black beneath the rain. No moon, no stars, only the sound of water hitting the sides of the boat. As he drifted past the old abandoned swamp, he suddenly heard children crying somewhere in the darkness, very faint, very far away. At first, he ignored it, because everyone knew stories about that place. But then, he heard a voice call his name, softly, from somewhere near the water. Gwen. The man immediately froze, because the voice sounded exactly like Aunt Lai. Slowly, he turned his flashlight toward the swamp, and there, standing waist-deep in the black water, was a woman. Long wet hair covered her face. One pale arm stretched toward him. For one horrible second, Uncle Gwen thought it really was his wife. Then lightning flashed across the sky, and he saw the truth. There were two heads. The old man dropped his flashlight and rode home in absolute panic. The next morning, he became deathly ill with a high fever and reportedly refused to speak about what he saw ever again. After that night, nobody in the village dared travel near the abandoned swamp after dark, ever, because some people believed the creature had never truly disappeared. The monk may have sealed it beneath the mud, but things buried in water do not always stay buried forever. And according to the narrator, during certain nights when the tide rises high enough, villagers still hear something dragging itself slowly through the swamp. Slurch, slurch, slurch,